What's up everyone, welcome back to Workshop Rebuild. In today's video, I'll share with you how to remove your old main bearing from your bearing retainer. This bearing retainer can be found on most BMW Airhead engines. Right after that, I'll also share with you guys how to install a brand new one, so let's dig right into it. I successfully removed the old main bearing from the retainer, and now I'll share with you guys the most important step, and that is the preparation for the assembly process. The first thing I want to talk about is the main bearing retainer. If you guys have a good understanding of this, it'll make it much easier to understand what's happening on the old main bearing and also what I'm going to have to do with the new main bearing. So on this main bearing retainer, you have to understand there will be oil supplied throughout this part. The oil passes through this port and it will be delivered into the groove that's machined all the way around the perimeter of this inside diameter. Now it doesn't stop just there, it also feeds through this main bearing and it goes into the inside diameter of this bearing, supplying oil between the bearing and the crankshaft. Now with that said, we also have to understand that oil passes through this part. So once oil is supplied to the main bearing on the inside diameter over here, there is one tiny oil passage right there, and there's also another one on the other side. When we look at it from the other side, you will notice that oil passage is right here, and the second one is on the other side right here. When we have a look at the main bearing, you will notice there are exactly two bores, one right here and one over here. They correspond with the holes inside the bearing retainer. And when we have a closer look at this main bearing, you will notice there's actually just one more hole on the opposite side, and that is for a locating pin. This locating pin will not allow the main bearing to turn or spin inside of this bearing retainer. I know that was a lot of information, but if you guys have any questions, drop a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Right now, I'll share with you guys what I have on this table. On the right side of the table, I still have this kit opened up where I have different sizes of discs. I have a 74mm and a 65mm disc laid out just in case I need to push in the new bearing into the main bearing retainer. Now I will be cooling off the main bearing, which means it will shrink, and I will heat up the main bearing retainer. So hopefully this will actually pass through by hand. And if I do need a little bit more help, I will be using this assembly of parts right here. Once I install the new main bearing into the bearing retainer, I can't stop right there. And that brings me to the next step, and I'll share this with you guys in depth. Before I just go ahead and install the new main bearing into the bearing retainer, it's really important for you to find the merging part of this main bearing. You will notice a male end and a female end. Just like on a puzzle, they come together and they are pushed together. I marked that with a black marker so I know where it is and it's easier for me to identify. Now if you guys have that marked, you will also want to mark that on your bearing retainer. This right here is your top dead center or your 0 degrees, and in the manual you should have a 26-degree offset, and I made another mark right here on this main bearing retainer. Another way to find your 26 degrees on your main bearing retainer is if you take your old main bearing. You want to mark one of the oil passageways that lines up with the retainer, And you also want to find the merging part, which is the male and female end of this main bearing that come together, and mark that with a black marker. You can hold it down on this main bearing, just like that. Make a mark on the main bearing retainer, and that right there is where you have to line up your new main bearing. So it's pretty straightforward. You either take your old main bearing and mark 26 degrees, or you go right off the middle and mark 26 degrees to install your brand new main bearing. Right after you install your new main bearing, you want to focus on your locating pin, and that's this part right here. This is still the old one and it's in great condition, so I can reuse it. In order for me to install that locating pin, I will need exactly 2 drills and I will need 1 reamer. These products will be listed down in the description if you'd like to pick them up yourself. Off to the left, I made 3 little sketches so you guys will have a better understanding of what I'm actually doing with these tools down below. For step number 1, you will have to understand the sketch first. The bigger portion on the top is the main bearing retainer, and the smaller portion is the main bearing insert. This bore already exists in the main bearing retainer, and I'll share that with you right here. So from this point right here, all the way down to that point, we have a bore going through. I don't have to modify anything. That's depicted right here. Now on the main bearing insert, especially if we install a brand new one, we will have to modify this portion, and that is just a little center point. To do that, we will be using a 3.99 millimeter drill, and we will come in here and we will make a little center. Now that's all we need to do, and I'll share that with you guys on the old main bearing. So when we come in with this drill, you will notice all it has to go down is just to that point right there. And once we have it at that point, we can bring it back up and we will have a center. For step number 2, the sketch looks exactly the same. The only thing that we have to do now is we have to drill all the way through, but with a smaller drill bit. The drill bit up above was 3.99 millimeters, and the drill bit that we'll be using right here is 3.5 millimeters. You will notice that on the old main bearing, the bore goes all the way through, and when I take the 3.5 millimeter drill, it goes all the way through as well. So if we come in here with the 3.5 millimeter drill, you will notice there's still material all the way around the perimeter, and that leaves us a little shoulder for step number 3. For step number 3, I will use a 4H8 reamer to ream the rest of this bore. Inside of the bearing retainer, no material should be removed because the bore is already to size. The only material we want to remove is inside of the bearing insert. We do not want to ream all the way through because we have to leave a shoulder inside of the bearing insert for our locating pin to sit inside of. According to the manual, we have to leave at least 20 to 40 thousandths of an inch from the inside diameter to the tip of the pin. When we're speaking about the bearing insert, it's exactly 100 thousandths of an inch thick. So what that means is we have to go just past halfway to achieve our final depth. I shared with you guys how to do everything theoretically, but now I'll share with you guys my installation process. As you guys just saw, I installed the main bearing insert into the main bearing retainer without any issues. I heated up the main bearing retainer to around 60 to 80 degrees Celsius, and I cooled down the main bearing insert to around minus 10 degrees Celsius. If you do this correctly, that should just drop into place and you shouldn't have any issues. The only thing that you want to watch out for is that your main bearing insert is flush with the bottom end of your main bearing retainer. You don't want your main bearing insert to be off in any way because that won't work for the rest of the engine assembly process. So just make sure it's flush on the bottom end of this retainer. All right, now I'm going to let this cool down and I'll bring you guys back for the next step. So I'll call this a success. I managed to install the brand new main bearing. Right after that, I installed the locating pin. The locating pin is only there to make sure that the bearing doesn't spin over time. If you guys want to install your own main bearing, I'll have all the tools listed down below in the description. And if you guys thought this video was helpful in any way, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button down below. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if you have any questions, drop a comment down below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. With that said, I'll see you guys in an upcoming video. Peace.